This is the VOA Special English Agriculture Report. Food prices have risen sharply in the past few years. The good news is that the rate of increase has slowed. The bad news is that prices will not go down anytime soon. Also, the rate of global agricultural production is slowing. But it needs to increase 60% over the next 40 years to feed a growing world population. These are some of the findings in the OECD FAO Agricultural Outlook 2012-2021. The OECD is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. The FAO is the Food and Agriculture Organization, a United Nations agency. FAO Director General José Graziano da Silva spoke at a news conference in Rome last month when the report was released. Mr. da Silva said, "The world's poorest people will feel the greatest effects of higher prices." He said for millions of people living in extreme poverty, the meaning of higher food prices is clear. They might have to change their diets, often to ones with less nutritional value. In middle-income countries, people are gaining weight. They are eating fewer fruits and vegetables, and they are eating less nutritious and cheaper food. The report also shows that farmers in poorer countries will be leading efforts to feed an expected 9 billion people by 2050. The outlook predicts that farmers in Latin America, the Caribbean, and sub-Saharan Africa will drive agricultural production in the future. Angel Gurria is chief of the OECD. He says we can feed 9 billion people by 2050 without stretching things too far. But he said we have to organize ourselves better. Still, there are many problems. 1/4 of all agricultural land is damaged. Many countries face water shortages, and experts believe climate change is driving increasingly unusual weather. The report says farmers need to use more environmentally sustainable growing methods. At the same time, it says governments should end economically harmful supports and invest more in agricultural production. Mr. Gurria says rich and poor nations need to treat agriculture more like a business. That also means reducing waste. The FAO and the OECD estimate that 1/3 of world food production is lost. This is either because of poor growing and harvesting methods or because people are throwing away good food. And that's the VOA Special English Agriculture Report. I'm Mario Ritter.
This is the VOA Special English Economics Report. Business is the most popular subject for international students in the United States. At last count, 22% of foreign students at American colleges and universities were studying business and management. The Institute of International Education in New York says engineering was the second most popular field. Thomas Kosei is a professor of marketing and business at the University of Richmond in Virginia. He says international students who want to study business need to have good English skills. At the same time, native English speakers who work with foreign companies may need to learn some new communication skills themselves. This is because the world has more non-native speakers of English than native speakers. At the University of Richmond, teams of graduate students work with companies seeking to enter the American market. The students learn about writing market entry studies. The reports are written in English, but Professor Kosei tells his students to consider who will read them. He said his students have to write the report so that it can be understood by someone who is an English speaker but not a native English speaker. For example, he tells his students to avoid jargon and other specialized terms that people might not know in their own language. This can be good advice even when writing for other native speakers. But effective communication involves more than just words. Kay Westerfield is director of the International Business Communication Program at the University of Oregon. She says you must have the language skills as well as cultural intelligence. Cultural intelligence means the need to consider local behaviors in everything from simple handshakes to speaking to large groups. Still, Kay Westerfield says the ability of foreign workers to speak English is becoming more important to companies looking to off-source operations to other countries. Also, she says English skills often provide a competitive edge for business students when they seek jobs. She said, as one business student in West Africa put it, English is a lifeline. For VOA Special English, I'm Alex Villarreal. We offer live English lessons Monday through Friday at the VOA Learning English page on Facebook. You can also read and listen to our programs and find activities for English learners at voaspecialenglish.com. And we have podcasts on iTunes.
This is the VOA Special English Health Report. Officials in the United States say deadly abuse of painkillers and other prescription drugs has reached epidemic levels. More than 36,000 people died from drug overdoses in 2008, the latest year available. That was almost as many as from road crashes. More than half of the overdoses involve drugs that need a doctor's approval, and 3/4 of those deaths involved what are called opioid painkillers. These include drugs like methadone, morphine, hydrocodone, also known as Vicodin, and oxycodone or Oxycontin. Death rates from prescription drugs were highest among people 45 to 54 years old. A recent government report said painkiller deaths more than tripled in the past decade. They now top the number of heroin and cocaine deaths combined. The Obama administration released a plan last year to try to deal with the problem. Some abusers seek help at places like the Malibu Beach Recovery Center near Los Angeles. They learn yoga and other ways to deal with anxiety, stress, and pain. Joan Borston heads the center. She says stopping is difficult because in the case of pain pills, the body has stopped producing its natural defenses to pain, and users have to have more and more. Around the country, special drug courts work with addicts to get them counseling and treatment. Marianne Gunn is a retired drug court judge. She now appears on Last Shot with Judge Gunn, a TV program that shows the effect of drugs on users and their families. She says in 1999, the big problem was methamphetamine. And we have addressed that and are continuing to address that. And more over the years, we began to see people being addicted to prescription drugs. James Adams is a pharmacologist at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. He says millions of people live with pain, much of it from arthritis caused by obesity and aging. And it's a real tough problem for a doctor, because here you've got a patient with chronic pain, and these patients know exactly how to get what they want. And if that doctor doesn't give it to them, they just go to the next doctor. He says many patients may be able to manage their pain if they lose weight and get exercise and physical therapy. Another solution, California and many other states have registries. These tell doctors and pharmacists what potentially dangerous drugs their patients are already taking. For VOA Special English, I'm Carolyn Prasuti.
Welcome to The Making of a Nation, American History in VOA Special English. On April 9, 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered his army to Union General Ulysses Grant. Within weeks, the Civil War would be over. When people in Washington learned of Lee's surrender, they hurried to the White House. The crowd wanted to hear from President Abraham Lincoln. The speech he gave would be one of his last, as Kay Gallant and Harry Monroe explained this week in our series.
President Lincoln spoke several days after General Lee's surrender. The people expected a victory speech, but Lincoln gave them something else. Already, he was moving forward from victory to the difficult times ahead. The Southern Rebellion was over. Now, he faced the task of rebuilding the Union. Lincoln did not want to punish the South. He wanted to rejoin the ties that the Civil War had broken. So, when the people of the North expected a speech of victory, he gave them a speech of reconstruction instead. On the night of April 11th, Lincoln appeared before a crowd outside the White House. He held a candle in one hand and his speech in the other.
Fellow citizens, Lincoln said, we meet this evening not in sorrow, but in gladness of heart. The surrender of the main army of the Confederacy gives hope of a righteous and speedy peace. The joy cannot be held back. By these recent successes, we have had pressed more closely upon us the question of Reconstruction. We all agree, Lincoln continued, that the so-called seceded states are out of their correct relation with the Union. We also agree that what the government is trying to do is get these states back into their correct relation. I believe it is not only possible, but in fact easier to do this without deciding the legal question of whether these states have ever been out of the Union. Finding themselves safely at home, it would be of no importance whether they had ever been away.
There was cheering and applause when President Lincoln finished, but less than when he began. The speech had been too long and too detailed to please the crowd. Lincoln, however, believed it a success. He hoped he had made the country understand one thing: the great need to forget hatred and bitterness in the difficult time of rebuilding that would follow the war. The President continued to discuss his ideas on Reconstruction over the next few days. On Friday, April 14th, he agreed to put this work aside for a while. In the afternoon, he took his wife Mary for a long drive away from the city. In the evening, they would go to the theater.
One of the popular plays of the time, called Our American Cousin, was being performed at Ford's Theater, not far from the White House. The Secretary of War did not want the Lincolns to go alone. He ordered an Army officer to go with them. The President and Mrs. Lincoln sat in special seats at Ford's Theater. The presidential box was above and to one side of the stage. A guard always stood outside the door to the box. On this night, however, the guard did not remain. He left the box unprotected.
President Lincoln settled down in his seat to enjoy the play. As he did so, a man came to the door of the box. He carried a gun in one hand and a knife in the other. The man entered the presidential box quietly. He slowly raised the gun. He aimed it at the back of Lincoln's head. He fired. Then the man jumped from the box to the stage, 3 meters below. Many in the theater recognized him. He was an actor, John Wilkes Booth. Booth broke his leg when he hit the stage floor, but he pulled himself up, shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus ever to tyrants, and ran out the door. He got on a horse and was gone.
The attack was so quick that the audience did not know what had happened. Then a woman shouted, "The president has been shot." Lincoln had fallen forward in his seat, unconscious. Someone asked if it was possible to move him to the White House. A young Army doctor said no. The president's wound was terrible. He would die long before reaching the White House. So Lincoln was moved to a house across the street from Ford's Theater. A doctor tried to remove the bullet from the president's head. He could not. Nothing could be done except wait. The end was only hours away.
Cabinet members began to arrive, while wild reports spread through the city. The Confederates had declared war again. There was fighting in the streets. An official of the War Department described the situation. The extent of the plot was unknown. From so horrible a beginning, what might come next? How far would the bloody work go? The safety of Washington must be looked after. The people must be told. The assassin and his helpers must be captured.
Early the next morning, April 15th, Abraham Lincoln died. A prayer was said over his body. His eyes were closed. The news went out by telegraph to cities and towns across the country. People read the words, but could not believe them. To millions of Americans, Abraham Lincoln's death was a personal loss. They had come to think of him as more than the President of the United States. He was a trusted friend. People hung black cloth on their doors in sorrow. Even the South mourned for Lincoln, its former enemy. Southern General Joe Johnston said, "Mr. Lincoln was the best friend we had. His death is the worst thing that could happen for the South."
Messages of regret came from around the world. British labor groups said they could never forget the things Lincoln had said about working people, things such as the strongest tie of human sympathy should be one uniting all working people of all nations and tongues. A group representing hundreds of French students sent this message: "In President Lincoln, we mourn a fellow citizen. There are no longer any countries shut up in narrow frontiers. Our country is everywhere where there are neither masters nor slaves, wherever people live in liberty or fight for it. We look to the other side of the ocean to learn how a people which has known how to make itself free knows how to preserve its freedom." The assassination of Abraham Lincoln touched the imagination of America's writers. Many tried to put their feelings into words. Walt Whitman wrote several poems of mourning. Here is part of one of them, "O Captain, my Captain."
Here, Captain, dear father, this arm beneath your head. It is some dream that on the deck you've fallen cold and dead. My captain does not answer. His lips are pale and still. My father does not feel my arm. He has no pulse nor will. The ship is anchored, safe and sound, its voyage closed and done. From fearful trip the victor ship comes in with object won. Exult, O shores, and ring, O bells, but I, with mournful tread, walk the deck my captain lies, fallen cold and dead.
Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in the spring. That is the time of year when lilac plants burst into flower throughout much of the United States. One of Walt Whitman's most beautiful poems in honor of Lincoln is called "When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed." Here is part of that poem.
When lilacs last in the dooryard bloomed, and the great star early drooped in the western sky in the night, I mourned, and yet shall mourn with ever-returning spring. Ever-returning spring, Trinity sure to me you bring, lilac, blooming perennial and drooping star in the west, and thought of him I love. Coffin that passes through lanes and streets, through day and night with the great cloud darkening the land, with the countless torches lit, with the silent sea of faces and the unbared heads, with the tolling, tolling bells' perpetual clang. Here, coffin that slowly passes, I give you my sprig of life.
This is the VOA Special English Economics Report. The United States Postal Service has reported a loss of over $5 billion from April to June. The Postal Service says it expects to report a loss of $15 billion for the 12-month period ending in September. And it has warned of even bigger losses if Congress does not let mail service change the way it does business. The United States Postal Service, or USPS, has a history as long as the nation's own. Benjamin Franklin was appointed the first Postmaster General, or head of the Postal Service, in 1775. But the Postal Service says its income has not kept up with growing costs. For example, profitable first-class mail is decreasing. The service says most of its recent losses resulted from making payments to its health care program for retirees. About $1 billion of the loss was for payments to injured workers. The news from April to June was not all bad. Improvements in the economy fueled income growth of 9% from shipping and delivery. The Postal Service says it is less costly to send letters and packages in the mail than to use private companies. The USPS says it has cut operating costs by a total of $14 billion in the past 5 years. To improve its financial health, the agency has proposed cutting service on Saturdays. It wants Congress to cancel a requirement that the Postal Service make payments to its health care program for retired workers. USPS also wants the Treasury Department to return $11 billion in payments made to its pension plan for retirees. On August 1st, USPS failed to make a required payment of $5.5 billion for health care benefits for future retirees. It was the first time the Postal Service has ever failed to make such a payment. And the service is warning that it may have to delay making payments to companies to which it owes money. The Postal Service says that without major changes, it will continue to lose billions of dollars a year. The Washington Post newspaper reported that Postmaster General Patrick Donahoe told reporters, Congress needs to act responsibly. In his words, this is no way to run any kind of business. The Postal Service receives income for its operations from the sale of stamps, products, and shipping services. It does not receive direct government assistance, but is controlled by the federal government. For VOA Learning English, I'm Laurel Bowman.
This is the VOA Special English Economics Report. Energy has become an important issue in the American presidential campaign. And gasoline prices, costs that affect almost all Americans, have risen sharply in recent months. For example, former Massachusetts Governor Mitt Romney has criticized President Obama's energy policy. In a newspaper commentary, he said the president has let prices rise while placing too many requirements on the energy industry. One issue in the political debate is a project proposed by the Canadian company TransCanada. Its Keystone XL pipeline would stretch more than 3,000 kilometers from Alberta, Canada, to several oil processing centers in the United States. If completed, the project would cost about $13 billion and transport over 1 million barrels of oil a day. The Republican Party has criticized President Obama for delaying work on the oil pipeline. Republican Doc Hastings serves in the United States Congress. He says the party wants to use all of the nation's energy resources. Mr. Hastings says that would include use of both the Keystone XL pipeline and oil exploration in coastal waters. He says Republicans in the House of Representatives have passed reforms that break down government barriers to America's natural resources. And he says the House has passed legislation that would open coastal areas to new oil exploration and production. In early March, President Obama visited a Daimler truck factory in North Carolina. He told workers that more oil exploration is not an easy answer to the nation's energy problems. He said the United States has 2% of the world's oil reserves, but uses 20% of the world's oil. He said this means that even with increased oil production, there is no easy answer to high gasoline prices. Workers at the North Carolina factory build alternative fuel vehicles. Mr. Obama told them that new sources of energy mean more jobs. The president has called for tax breaks on clean energy vehicles and urged local governments to buy them. He also has asked lawmakers to end $4 billion in support for the oil and gas industries. For VOA Special English, I'm Carolyn Presutti. You can download texts and MP3s of our programs and learn English at voaspecialenglish.com. This is the VOA Special English Health Report. Tourists come to Zanzibar for its white sand beaches and historic buildings in Stone Town. But something else also makes its way to the Tanzanian island: heroin, trafficked across the Indian Ocean from Asia. Most of the heroin shipped through East Africa is headed for Europe and North America. But Rashad Abdul of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime says a lot of it stays on the continent. We know for a fact that heroin is being used in at least 30 countries in Africa. And we also know for a fact that the number of countries reporting injecting drug use, especially of heroin, is also increasing in Africa. The problem in Zanzibar has led to some creative local solutions. Suleiman Mali stopped using heroin 6 years ago. Now he operates a network of so-called sober houses. These are run by addicts themselves to help one another recover. There are 9 sober houses, 8 for men and 1 for women. Mr. Mali himself went through a drug treatment program in Kenya, but it cost around $2,000, he says. Staying in a sober house costs about $100 a month. Most of the people are supported by their families. treatment is based on the idea that drug addiction is more of a public health problem than a crime. Mr. Mali says this is still a new idea to many people. Because addiction, it's a disease, and addicts need treatment. But people, they hear that addicts are bad people and they need punishment. He says in the sober houses, the addicts are in charge of nearly everything. It's a new method to Zanzibar. It's a new phenomenon to East Africa, whereby drug addicts take responsibility to run the system. This responsibility, he says, is important to building their belief in their own abilities. The men also learn woodworking as a way to earn money. Much of the program is based on the 12-step program of Alcoholics Anonymous. But it also includes art therapy, yoga, and even acupuncture. This is done by Kasim Nouni, a sober house counselor and former addict. He was trained by a volunteer from a Chinese medical school in Hawaii. It reduces tension and it's relaxing. It's a kind of treatment that's very effective for the recovering addicts. Still, he estimates that around 60% of those in the program return to heroin. Suleiman Mali hopes to expand the network in Zanzibar. His next goal is to send former addicts to work with heroin users in prisons. For VOA Special English, I'm Carolyn Persutti.